The alarm on my wrist screen did not blink. It just glowed red and stayed that way, which was worse. A blinking light means something is wrong and someone is fixing it. A steady red light means the fixing part is already over. I was standing in the mess hall of the coalition ship Halcyon Point when it happened, holding a cup of something that was supposed to taste like coffee. Around me, 3 other species were eating, arguing, laughing in sounds my ears were still learning to sort into meaning. Then my screen turned red, and every human in that room went quiet at the exact same second, like someone had pulled a single string that ran through all of us. The message was short. It came from Meridian Colony, a small farming settlement on the edge of charted space, population 11,000. My home. My sister was one of those 11,000. The message said, food reserves seized under Vethron Cultural Exchange Protocol, colony stable, no further contact required. No further contact required. As if we had asked a question and this was simply the answer. I want to tell you about the Vethrans because after this story, you will understand why almost nobody does. Not because we forgot them, because we made a choice not to remember them out loud, and that choice turned out to be the loudest thing humanity has ever done. The Vethrans were beautiful, in the way a glacier is beautiful. Tall, silver-skinned, with voices that carried a natural musical quality other species found soothing. They had been part of the coalition for nearly 2 centuries before humans ever arrived, and in that time they had built a reputation for calm diplomacy and generous trade. When the Vethrans made first contact with a new species, they did not send warships. They sent gifts. They studied a species, learned what that species valued most, and then took a small, careful portion of it, always explaining that this was simply how respect worked among their people. A partnership begins with sacrifice, they would say. We take only what a species can afford to lose. For most species in the coalition, this custom was survivable, even flattering in a strange way. The Drenari valued minerals, and the Vethrans took a modest percentage of ore from a single mining world, then left the Drenari alone for a generation. The Olmekai valued knowledge, and the Vethrans copied a portion of their archives, then never asked again. It was, by their standards, a small price for lasting peace. Nobody objected loudly enough to matter, because objecting seemed rude, and because the loss, spread across an entire species, felt almost small. Humans were different, and the Vethrans did not understand why until it was far too late to matter to them. When Vethran scout ships first studied our worlds, they did what they always did. They watched, they listened, they built a profile of what humanity valued most. And they concluded, correctly on the surface, that humans valued food security above almost everything else. Our history is soaked in famine, our stories, our religions, our arguments about land and rivers and rain, nearly all of it traces back to the fear of an empty table. The Vethrans read this history and thought they understood us. They believed that because food mattered so much to humans, taking a small, careful, generous portion of it would be the deepest possible sign of respect, exactly as it had been for every other species before us. They were wrong in a way that would follow them for the rest of their existence. Meridian Colony had been founded 11 years earlier by families who wanted to build something with their own hands, far from crowded home systems. My sister Elena had gone there when she was 22, newly married, full of the kind of hope that only exists in people who have not yet been disappointed by the universe. She grew wheat that had been engineered to survive thin atmosphere. She wrote to me twice a month, always ending her letters the same way. Come see us when your service ends. Bring someone nice. The Vethran ships arrived at Meridian on a morning that colony records describe as clear and quiet. 3 vessels, unarmed by every scan the colony had. The Vethran ambassador, a diplomat named Corvain Thess, requested a meeting with the colony council and offered what he called a gesture of partnership. He explained, in that soft musical voice, that the coalition wished to formally welcome Meridian into deeper cooperation, and that Vethran custom required a token exchange to seal the bond. The council, trusting the coalition's reputation, agreed to a meeting the following day. That night, without further warning, Vethran transport beams lifted a significant portion of the colony's stored grain, seed reserves, and livestock directly from their storage facilities and pastures. Not all of it. The Vethrans were, by their own account, careful. They left enough for the colony to survive the season, calculated down to a margin they considered generous. In the morning, Corvan Thess sent a formal message thanking the colony for their new partnership and expressing hope for continued friendship. The colony had not agreed to anything. They had agreed to a meeting. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because this is the part of the story that other species still misunderstand. There was no colony militia storming Vethran ships. There was no violence at Meridian that morning, none at all. What happened was quieter and, I have come to believe, far more dangerous. The colony council sat in silence for 11 minutes after reading Corvan Thess's message. 11 minutes, timed exactly, because the meeting room's recorder caught the whole thing. Nobody shouted. Nobody cried. My sister was in that room, representing the agricultural cooperative, and she told me later that the silence felt like standing at the edge of very cold water, right before you decide whether to step in. Then the council chair, a woman named Margaret Voss who had raised 4 children on that colony, spoke exactly one sentence. "Send this to every human world we can reach," she said, "and then send it to everyone else too." That is where I come into the story properly, standing in the mess hall of the Halcyon Point, with a lukewarm cup of coffee in my hand and a red light on my wrist that would not stop glowing. My name is Daniel Hale. I was 26 years old, a communications and reconnaissance specialist assigned to the Coalition fleet as part of humanity's small but growing military presence among the stars. I had been trained to remain calm under pressure, to keep my voice level during crisis broadcasts, to be, in every visible way, the picture of controlled professionalism that our species had worked hard to project to our new neighbors. Humans had a reputation in the Coalition, earned over several decades of careful behavior, for being unnervingly composed. Other species sometimes joked, not unkindly, that humans seemed to feel less than everyone else, because we so rarely showed it. I remember reading the message from Meridian 3 times before the words settled into something my mind could accept. Then I set down the coffee, and I walked to my quarters, and I began packing a bag with hands that did not shake even slightly, which frightened me more than shaking would have. Around the ship, other humans were doing the same thing, not gathering to talk, not comparing outrage, just quietly, individually, preparing, each of us moving through the corridors like water finding the fastest path downhill. A Drenari engineer named Oskal, who had worked beside me for 2 years and considered himself something close to a friend, stopped me in the corridor and asked what was happening. I told him, in a flat, even voice, exactly what had happened at Meridian. He tilted his head, a Drenari gesture of confusion, and asked why I was not more upset. I did not have an answer for him then. I do now. I was not calm because I felt nothing. I was calm because the part of me capable of screaming had already finished screaming. Privately, in the 2 minutes between reading the message and closing my eyes to steady myself. What was left after that was not calm exactly. It was purpose, arriving to fill the space where panic usually lives. I requested emergency transfer to the nearest human command post, a modest station called Ashgrove Relay, 3 days from Meridian, by fast transport. My request went to my commanding officer, a woman named Colonel Grant Whitfield, who had served for over 20 years and had a face that gave away nothing to anyone who was not human. She read my request in front of me, said nothing for almost a full minute, and then signed it without asking a single question. That silence told me more than 100 questions could have. She already knew. She had likely known before I did, through channels reserved for command staff, and she had already begun making decisions of her own, decisions that would not become clear to the rest of the Coalition for several more days. As I left her office, she said one more thing to me, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "Document everything, Hale. Every detail. We are not going to raise our voices about this. We are going to make sure nobody in this coalition can ever pretend they did not know exactly what happened. I did not fully understand what she meant. I would, very soon. The trip to Ashgrove Relay felt longer than 3 days. I spent most of it reviewing everything the colony had managed to send before Vethran diplomatic channels quietly restricted Meridian's outgoing transmissions, a restriction the Vethrans described, without apparent irony, as a temporary bandwidth courtesy during the transition period. I watched recordings of the council meeting. I listened to Margaret Voss's 11 minutes of silence, time-stamped and unbroken. I read messages from families describing storage facilities that had been full the night before and were now nearly empty, describing pastures where livestock had simply vanished between one patrol and the next. No struggle, no evidence, nothing but Vethran transport residue that any competent scanner could detect within minutes. And I found, buried in the colony's public agricultural log, a note from my sister Elena, sent the morning after the seizure, before outgoing messages were restricted. It was not addressed to me. It was addressed to the colony's children, part of a broadcast she gave every week over the local education channel, something she had done since the colony was founded, teaching young kids about the crops that fed them. Her voice, calm and steady in the recording, explained to a room full of children that some of their food had been taken by visitors who did not understand how much it meant to the people who grew it. She told them that being frightened was allowed, but that panic would not fix anything, and that the adults were already working on a plan. Then she told them a story about a very old harvest festival, one that celebrated not abundance, but survival through a difficult season, and she asked them to help her plan one for this year. I sat alone in a transport cabin somewhere between the stars and listened to my sister teach children how to be brave, 3 hours after strangers had stolen the food meant to keep those same children alive through the coming season. I did not cry. I want to say I did, because it would make me sound more human in the telling, but the truth is that something in me went very still and very cold instead, and that stillness is what carried me the rest of the way to Ashgrove Relay. When I arrived, the station was already full of humans who had done exactly what I had done. Communications specialists, logistics officers, 2 doctors, a handful of off-duty pilots, all of us pulled toward the same gravity without a single coordinated order sent between us. Colonel Whitfield had not summoned us. We had simply come, the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet nobody can see. In the station's main hall, I found roughly 40 people gathered, and the room was almost silent. Not the silence of people waiting for instructions, the silence of people who already knew exactly what needed to happen and were simply organizing themselves to do it, without wasting a single unnecessary word. A young logistics officer named Grace Ferris was setting up a secure relay terminal at the center of the room. I recognized her from a training exercise 2 years earlier, a sharp, quiet woman who rarely spoke unless she had something worth saying. She looked up as I walked in, gave me a short nod, and said only this: "We are building the record. Everything from Meridian, every transmission, every timestamp, cross-referenced with Vethran diplomatic archives so nothing can be denied later. When it is finished, we send it everywhere at once. Every human world, every allied species, every media network in this coalition that will carry it." I asked her what happened after that. She looked at me for a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes that I would only fully understand days later, once I had seen where all of this was going. "After that," she said, "we stopped talking about them at all." I did not understand her then. I thought she meant something small, some temporary diplomatic freeze while tempers cooled. I did not yet understand that humanity, as a species, had already begun making a decision that would not involve shouting, would not involve threats, would not involve a single act of open confrontation. We were choosing something colder than anger. We were choosing to erase the Vethrans from the part of our attention where enemies are allowed to exist, and to place them instead in the part where nothing exists at all. I spent the rest of that day helping Grace and the others assemble the record, cross-checking timestamps, verifying veteran transport signatures against colony sensor logs, making absolutely certain that every claim we would eventually send across the coalition could survive any challenge. Nobody raised their voice the entire time. Nobody made a single threat against the Vethrans, not in any message, not in any private conversation I overheard. We simply built the truth, brick by careful brick, until it was strong enough to stand entirely on its own. Late that night, after most of the others had gone to rest, I sat alone with the finished record open on the terminal in front of me. Every transmission from Meridian, every timestamp, my sister's voice, calm and steady, teaching children about survival through a difficult season, 3 hours after everything had been taken from beneath her. I read Colonel Whitfield's message from earlier that day one more time. Document everything. We are not going to raise our voices about this. I understood, finally, what kind of fury I was witnessing. It did not look like fury at all. It looked exactly like patience, and that was what made it so much harder for anyone watching from the outside to see it coming. Somewhere across the coalition, on a Vethran diplomatic vessel that had no idea what it had just started, Ambassador Corvain Thess was likely composing another message about partnership and respect, entirely unaware that the species he believed he understood so well had already begun closing a door that would never open again. I closed the terminal, turned off the light in my quarters, and lay awake for a long time, thinking about my sister's voice, and about how strange it was that the quietest room I had ever sat in felt more dangerous than any battlefield I had trained for. Outside my window, the stars moved past at a steady, unhurried pace, indifferent to what was coming. I did not know yet exactly what form our answer would take. I only knew, with a certainty that settled into my chest like something physical, that whatever it was, the Vethrans would not see it coming until it had already happened to them completely. Morning on Ashgrove Relay came without a sunrise, since the station had no windows facing any star, only a slow shift in the corridor lighting from deep blue to pale white that was supposed to mimic dawn for anyone who needed the reminder. I had not slept more than 2 hours. Neither, it seemed, had anyone else. By the time I reached the main hall, the room that had held 40 people the night before now held closer to 90. Word had spread through channels I never saw used, quiet requests for transfer, quiet approvals, quiet arrivals on shuttles that had not been scheduled a day earlier. Nobody had announced a gathering. Humans across 3 sectors had simply begun moving toward the same point, the way people once walked toward a lit window during a storm without needing to be told where shelter was. Grace Ferris was already at the terminal, eyes red from lack of sleep, still working. She told me the record was almost finished, that verification teams on 2 other stations had cross-checked every timestamp against independent sensor data, and that nothing in it could be challenged without also challenging basic physics. I asked her what came after finishing it. She said the record would go up the chain first, to command, and only after that to the wider coalition. Timing mattered. She would not tell me more than that, not because she distrusted me, but because she genuinely did not know the full plan herself. Nobody in that room did. We were each holding a single piece of something larger, something being assembled in places above our clearance, and the trust required to keep working without seeing the whole picture was, I think now, its own kind of quiet courage. To understand why a stolen harvest could move an entire species to this kind of coordinated wordless response, you would need to understand something about where humans come from, and I think this is the part of the story that other coalition species have always struggled with the most. Every species in the coalition has its own history of hardship, its own old wounds it does not like to discuss at diplomatic dinners. But few species carry a relationship with food quite like ours. For most of human history, going back further than any written record, the difference between a good harvest and a failed one was the difference between a village surviving the winter and a village disappearing from the map entirely. Our oldest stories are full of granaries and famine years, full of festivals held not to celebrate wealth, but to celebrate simply having enough. Long after we solved hunger through technology, the fear of it never fully left us. It settled into something deeper than memory. it became instinct. When the Vethrans took grain from Meridian, they were not stealing food from people who would go hungry that week. The colony had enough stored elsewhere, enough support from nearby systems, to avoid any real physical hardship. What the Vethrans had actually done, without understanding it, was reach into the oldest and most guarded room in the human mind and take something from it without asking. They had touched the fear itself, not the supply. I tried to explain this to Oskal, my Drenari colleague, later that day when he found me in the station's observation deck, staring out at nothing in particular. He listened carefully, the way he always did, and then asked a question that I did not have a good answer for at the time. If the colony was never truly at risk, he asked, why does this feel to your people like the worst thing the Vethrans could have done? I told him I did not fully know how to explain it, and that was true. It took me several more days, and everything that followed, to understand the answer well enough to say it out loud. The Vethrans had not simply taken food. They had assumed, without asking, that they understood us completely, that they had studied us thoroughly enough to know exactly what we could afford to lose. And they had been wrong in a way that revealed something uncomfortable about how little respect had actually been present in their gesture of respect. A gift you take without permission is not a gift. It is a decision made about someone else's life, on their behalf, by a stranger who never once considered that the answer might be no. Oskal sat with that for a long moment, and then said something I have never forgotten. Among my people, he said, when a stranger decides something about your life without asking, we do not call that partnership, we call it something else. I asked him what word his people used. He told me the word did not translate cleanly, but the closest meaning was something like theft dressed in kindness. I told him that was, more or less, exactly right. Later that afternoon, Colonel Whitfield called a small group of us into a secure briefing room, the first time since the crisis began that any of us had been given more than a single order at a time. She stood at the head of a long table, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. She explained, carefully and without any dramatic emphasis, what Human Command had decided over the previous 2 days, working in coordination with civilian leadership across every major human settlement. There would be no armed response against the Vethrans, not because humanity lacked the capability, and not because anyone in that room felt forgiveness toward what had happened at Meridian. The decision had been made for a colder, more deliberate reason. An armed response, she explained, would hand the Vethrans exactly what they needed. It would let them cast humanity as reckless, as dangerously emotional, as a young species that could not be trusted among more civilized neighbors. It would give the rest of the coalition a story they already half expected to hear, since many species still quietly assumed humans were simply more violent than the rest of them, no matter how many decades we had spent proving otherwise. Instead, she said, we are going to give them something they cannot turn into a story about us at all. She would not yet explain the full plan, only that it would begin with the record Grace and her team had spent 2 days building, and that its release would be timed carefully, sent not just to human worlds, but to every media network and diplomatic office across the entire coalition simultaneously, faster than any single government could control the narrative around it. After that, she said, the plan required patience, coordination between civilian trade networks and human logistics command, and something she called, without further explanation, a full and complete withdrawal of acknowledgement. I asked her directly what that meant. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet in a way that made the whole room lean in slightly to hear her. It means, she said, that as far as every human system, every human trade route, every human diplomatic channel, and every human record is concerned, starting the moment this record is released, the Vethrans stop existing to us. Not as an enemy. An enemy is still something you look at, still something you argue with, still something you fight. We are not going to fight them. We are going to remove them entirely from the category of things we respond to at all. The room was silent after that. I remember looking around at the other faces gathered there, human and otherwise, and seeing the same expression settle over each of them slowly, one after another, as the full weight of what she had described took hold. It was not a plan built on outrage. It was a plan built on the coldest kind of discipline, the kind that requires an entire species to agree, without needing to be told twice, that some wounds are not answered with noise. Grace spoke up from near the back of the room, her voice steady. She asked how long the withdrawal would need to last to matter. Colonel Whitfield's answer was simple: as long as it takes for everyone else in this coalition to notice that we mean it. That evening, I returned to the observation deck to find several other humans already there, standing quietly, watching the stars in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it at all. Nobody spoke much. A pilot named Owen Blake stood near the window with his arms crossed, staring out at nothing in particular, the same way I had been earlier. When I asked him how he was holding up, he gave a short, humorless laugh and said something I think captures the mood of that entire station better than anything else I witnessed. "We are not angry," he said. "We are done. There is a difference, and it is going to take the rest of this coalition a very long time to understand what that difference actually means." I thought about my sister again, standing in front of a room of frightened children the morning after everything had been taken, telling them a story about surviving a difficult season instead of a story about revenge. I understood, standing there on that observation deck, that the plan being built around me was, in its own strange way, an extension of exactly what she had done. Not a plan built on fury, a plan built on the quiet, patient discipline of people who had decided, long before any of us were born, that surviving with dignity mattered more than reacting with noise. 2 days later, the record was finished. Every timestamp verified, every claim cross-checked against independent sensor data from 3 separate coalition tracking stations that had no reason to favor humanity in any dispute. Grace ran the final review herself, twice, sitting alone at the terminal long after everyone else had gone to rest, because she wanted to be completely certain that nothing in what we were about to release could ever be challenged, denied, or explained away. I found her there near the middle of the night, still working, and asked if she needed anything. She looked up at me, exhaustion written plainly across her face, and said only one thing before returning to her screen. "Once this goes out, there is no bringing it back. I need it to be perfect, because we are only going to say this once, and then we are never going to talk about them again." I sat with her for the rest of that night, helping where I could, mostly just keeping her company through the final hours before something irreversible began. Outside the station, the stars continued their slow, indifferent movement, the same as they had every night before, utterly unaware that somewhere in the darkness between them, an entire species was about to learn exactly what it meant to be answered by a silence that refused to end. By the time the pale morning light returned to the corridors of Ashgrove Relay, the record was ready, verified beyond any reasonable challenge, and waiting only for the signal that would send it everywhere at once. I stood beside Grace as she prepared the final transmission, and for the first time since reading that red message in the mess hall of the Halcyon Point, I felt something other than the cold stillness that had carried me through the days before. I felt certain that whatever happened next, the Vethrans had made a mistake they did not yet understand, and that humanity, in its own careful and unhurried way, was about to make sure they understood it completely, one silence at a time. The transmission went out at exactly 0600 station time, and I remember watching the counter on Grace's terminal climb from 0 to 100% completion in under 4 minutes, a number that meant almost nothing to me visually, but that represented, in practice, the entire coalition receiving the same set of facts at the same moment, with no government, no ambassador, and no diplomatic office given the chance to shape the story before the public saw it whole. I did not stay on Ashgrove Relay to watch what happened next. 2 hours after the transmission completed, I boarded a fast transport bound for Meridian itself, carrying formal clearance to join the human logistics team that would help the colony recover, and, more importantly, carrying a personal need I had not spoken aloud to anyone. I needed to see my sister. I needed to know with my own eyes, that she was still the same steady, unshaken woman who had spoken to a room full of frightened children as though the universe still made sense. The trip took just under 2 days. I spent most of it doing what I had done since the beginning, watching, reading, absorbing every fragment of information that reached the transport's public feed. And what I watched, over those 2 days, was not an explosion of anger sweeping across the coalition. It was something stranger, and in its own way, far more unsettling to witness. The record itself was simple and undeniable. Sensor logs, timestamps, Vethran transport signatures matched precisely against the moment Meridian storage facilities and pastures had been emptied. My sister's recorded broadcast to the colony's children, played in full, without commentary, without editing, exactly as she had delivered it. Margaret Voss's 11 minutes of silence, timed and unbroken, followed by her single sentence, sent this to everyone, sent it exactly as spoken. Coalition media networks that had never given much attention to human affairs suddenly could not stop discussing it. Not because humans were shouting about it. We were not. Human officials, when interviewed, gave almost identical, carefully rehearsed responses. We have released the complete and verified record of what occurred at Meridian Colony. We have no further statement at this time. No accusations beyond the facts themselves. No demands. No threats. Just the record, presented once, and then silence from every human voice that followed. It was that silence, more than the record itself, that seemed to unsettle the rest of the coalition the most. I watched, over those 2 days, as species after species reacted in ways that revealed how little they understood about what they were witnessing. Several governments issued statements expressing concern and calling for calm, apparently assuming that humanity was building toward some dramatic retaliation that simply had not been announced yet. Coalition security analysts speculated openly about military mobilization, about possible strikes against Vethran assets, about the kind of response that every other species assumed was inevitable once emotions reached a certain point. None of it happened. There was no mobilization. There were no strikes. Human fleets remained exactly where they had been before the crisis began, engaged in the same patrols, the same maintenance schedules, the same routine operations as always. To any outside observer studying troop movements or fleet positioning, it would have looked as though nothing unusual was happening within humanity at all. But something was happening, quietly, in places that troop movements could not show. I learned the details slowly, piece by piece, through conversations with people connected to logistics and trade networks I had never paid much attention to before. Human shipping companies, independently and without any centralized order I could ever find evidence of, began declining new contracts with any business known to have Vethran ownership or significant Vethran investment. Human trade representatives at coalition economic summits began arriving at meetings involving Vethran delegates and finding, through what was always described as unfortunate scheduling difficulty, that the relevant human officials were unavailable that day, and the day after, and the week after that. It was not sabotage. It was not any single decision that could be pointed to and challenged as an act of aggression. It was thousands of small, individual choices, made independently by human businesses, human officials, human logistics coordinators across dozens of systems, all arriving at the same conclusion without needing to consult each other first. The Vethrans had shown, through their actions at Meridian, exactly how much respect they held for human boundaries. Humans, in response, simply stopped extending the kind of trust that had made cooperation possible in the first place. I asked Oskal about this, once I finally reached Meridian and had a private channel to speak with him again. He told me that Drenari economic analysts were struggling to model what was happening, because every model they built assumed some form of centralized coordination, some official policy issued from human command that could be identified, studied, and predicted. But there was no single policy. There were only individual humans, each deciding on their own that the Vethrans no longer deserved the benefit of the doubt, and somehow, without ever discussing it directly, arriving at nearly identical conclusions at nearly the same time. "It is like watching a body remove a splinter," Oskal said, choosing his words carefully. "No single cell decides to do this, and yet somehow, all at once, the entire system moves in the same direction, and the splinter is gone before anyone can explain exactly how it happened." I did not correct him, though privately I thought his comparison was not quite right. A splinter is removed through a single sharp motion, over quickly, done and forgotten. What was happening to the Vethrans was slower than that, and far more permanent. When I finally reached Meridian, the colony looked, on the surface, almost ordinary. Fields still stretched toward a pale horizon. Children still played in the open spaces between buildings. But there was a quality to the place that I felt the moment I stepped off the transport, something I can only describe as careful. People moved through their routines with a deliberate steadiness, as though everyone had silently agreed to hold themselves together for the sake of everyone else, and the agreement was working, but only just. My sister met me at the transport dock. She looked thinner than I remembered, tired in a way that went beyond simple lack of sleep, but her eyes were exactly as steady as they had been in the recording I had listened to so many times during the journey. She hugged me tightly, longer than either of us usually allowed ourselves, and when she finally stepped back, she asked me a single question before anything else. "Did it work?" she asked. "Whatever they are doing out there, is it actually working?" I told her I did not fully know yet, that these things took time to show their full effect, but that something had clearly already begun, something larger than either of us could see completely from where we stood. She nodded slowly, and then she said something that stayed with me for the rest of this story, something that I think captures exactly what our species had chosen to become in that moment. "I do not want revenge, Daniel," she said. "I want them to understand, completely, that what they did was not survivable for a relationship built on trust. I want every species watching to understand it too. That is not the same thing as wanting them to suffer. It is wanting them to finally see clearly, for the first time, what they actually did." I spent the next several days helping the colony with recovery logistics, coordinating incoming supply shipments from nearby human systems that had responded to Meridian's need with a speed and generosity that surprised even the colony's own leadership. Every human world within reach had sent something: grain, livestock, equipment, medical support, all arriving faster than official channels could have organized it, as though the entire species had simply decided, individually and collectively, that this colony would not be allowed to feel the absence of what had been taken from it. During one of those days, I sat with Margaret Voss in the same council room where she had spoken her single sentence into 11 minutes of silence. She was older than I expected, her hands weathered from decades of work, her voice quieter in person than it had sounded in the recording. I asked her what she had been thinking during those 11 minutes before she finally spoke. She considered the question carefully before answering. "I was thinking," she said, "about every story my grandmother told me about hard winters, about people who survived because they refused to let fear make their decisions for them. I was thinking about what kind of colony we wanted to be remembered as, years from now, when people asked what happened here. I decided we would be remembered as the colony that did not panic, and I decided that the rest of humanity needed to see exactly what had been done to us, without any anger attached to it, because the truth alone would be enough." She was right. The truth alone had been enough, and it was still spreading. Roughly 2 weeks after the record's release, I received word through official channels that Ambassador Corvain Thess had requested an emergency meeting with human diplomatic representatives, the first direct communication attempt from any Vethran official since the crisis began. I was not present for that meeting, but a transcript eventually became part of the public coalition record, and I have read it more times than I can count since then, because it captures, better than anything else I witnessed, the exact moment the Vethrans finally began to understand what they had triggered. Corvain Thess opened the meeting by expressing what he called deep concern over what he described as a misunderstanding regarding cultural exchange protocols, and he offered, on behalf of the Vethran Diplomatic Council, a formal gesture of reconciliation, including the return of a portion of the resources taken from Meridian Colony, along with additional supplies as a sign of continued goodwill. The human representative present, a senior diplomat whose name I will leave out of this account, listened to the entire offer without interruption. When Corvain Thess finished speaking, the transcript records a pause of nearly 30 seconds before the human representative responded. Her response, according to the transcript, was brief. She thanked Ambassador Thess for his time, confirmed that the record released 2 weeks earlier remained the complete and final human account of what had occurred, and stated that human diplomatic channels had no further comment or requests to make regarding the Vethran people at this time. She then left the meeting. No demands, no conditions for reconciliation, no path forward offered, and none requested, just a closed door, delivered with perfect politeness, in a tone that offered nothing at all to push back against. I later learned, through Oskal and other coalition contacts, that this meeting marked a turning point in how the wider coalition understood what humanity had done. Species who had spent 2 weeks assuming humans were simply gathering strength before an eventual confrontation began to realize, slowly and with growing unease, that no confrontation was coming. There would be no ultimatum to negotiate, no grievance to formally resolve, no path back to the relationship that had existed before Meridian. Humanity had not declared the Vethrans an enemy. We had declared them irrelevant, and irrelevance, it turned out, could not be negotiated with. Ambassador Corvain Thess, according to accounts that reached me much later, requested 2 additional meetings with human representatives over the following month. Both requests were acknowledged, and both were met, eventually, with polite scheduling delays that never resolved into an actual meeting. Not a refusal. Never a refusal. Just an absence that kept extending itself, day after day, until the absence became its own unmistakable answer. I stayed on Meridian for nearly a month, helping the colony rebuild what had been lost, watching my sister slowly return to the steady, unshaken woman I had always known her to be. The fields recovered faster than anyone expected, helped along by the flood of support from human worlds that had refused to let the colony feel abandoned. Children returned to her weekly broadcasts, and she told me once, near the end of my stay, that she had started teaching them something new alongside the old harvest stories. She called it, simply, the lesson of Meridian, and she said she hoped none of them would ever need to use it, but that she wanted them to understand it all the same. The lesson, as she explained it to me, was this: when someone takes something from you without asking, the correct response is not always noise. Sometimes the correct response is to tell the truth completely, once, clearly, and then to let your absence do the rest of the work. Anger fades. Silence, chosen carefully and held with discipline, does not. I did not fully understand, standing in that colony among the recovering fields, exactly how far that silence was going to reach, or how long it would last. I would learn that over the months that followed, as the effects of what had begun at Meridian spread outward through the coalition in ways none of us, not even the officials who had planned the initial response, could have fully predicted. I returned to active duty 3 months after leaving Meridian, reassigned to a coalition monitoring station called Corin Watch, tasked with tracking trade movement and diplomatic activity across the outer systems. It was there, watching numbers scroll across screens rather than living through events directly, that I began to understand the true scale of what humanity had set in motion, and how completely the rest of the coalition had misjudged us at the beginning. The first sign came from trade data, dry and unremarkable at first glance, the kind of information that most people would scroll past without a second thought. Vethran shipping contracts, once numerous across nearly every major trade route in the coalition, had begun quietly declining. Not collapsing all at once, which might have drawn attention and sympathy, declining slowly, steadily, contract by contract, as human shipping networks, still the backbone of a significant portion of coalition logistics, continued their quiet policy of simply not choosing Vethran partners when other options existed. It would have been easy for other species to fill that gap, and for a while, some tried. New shipping agreements formed between veteran companies and other coalition members eager to claim the business humans had stepped away from. But something strange kept happening to those new arrangements, something that took me weeks of studying the data to fully understand. Human-controlled waypoints, the massive transit stations that connected trade routes across dozens of systems, began experiencing what official reports consistently described as unusual administrative delays affecting Vethran-registered vessels. Never a denial of passage, never an official restriction that any diplomatic office could formally protest. Just paperwork that took slightly longer to process, inspections that ran slightly longer than average, scheduling windows that always seemed to open up for everyone except Vethran ships, which somehow always found themselves at the back of a queue that never quite seemed to move. I raised this pattern with a station administrator during a routine briefing, a woman named Ivy Bennett, who had run waypoint operations for nearly a decade. I asked her directly whether this was official policy. She looked at me for a long moment, the same careful, unreadable look I had come to recognize from Colonel Whitfield months earlier, and told me that every delay on record could be individually justified, that nothing in the data would ever show a coordinated pattern, and that she had no further comment on the matter. Then she smiled, very slightly, and returned to her work. That was when I finally understood the shape of what humanity had built. It was not a policy, it was a culture, a shared understanding spread across an entire species without ever needing to be written down in any official document. Every human working in trade, logistics, diplomacy, or transit administration had absorbed, independently, the same unspoken standard, and they carried it out with a consistency that no top-down order could ever have achieved. You could not sue a culture. You could not negotiate with a habit shared by billions of people who had each privately decided the Vethrans no longer deserved the benefit of the doubt. A young coalition officer named Corin Vass, an Olmecai analyst assigned temporarily to Corin Watch to study exactly this pattern, spent several weeks working alongside me, trying to model what was happening. He was younger than most officers I had worked with, still carrying the kind of open curiosity that had not yet been worn down by years of routine, and he asked me, one evening while we reviewed another batch of delayed shipping data, a question I had been waiting for someone to ask for months. "Why did your species not simply fight them?" he asked. "It would have been faster. It would have been, in some ways, easier to understand for everyone watching. Instead, you built something so slow and so quiet that most of the coalition still does not fully understand what is happening to the Vethrans, even now." I thought about how to answer him honestly, because I did not want to give him the simple, practiced response that human officials had been offering the media for months. I wanted him to actually understand. I told him that fighting the Vethrans would have given them a story to tell. A war has two sides, and even a losing side gets remembered as having fought bravely, as having stood for something. If humanity had struck back with force after Meridian, the Vethrans would have had a narrative available to them, one where they could cast themselves as victims of human aggression, where they could point to human warships and say, "Look what they did to us over a simple misunderstanding." It would have given every neutral species in the coalition a way to feel sympathy for them, or at least a way to remain uncertain about who had actually been wronged. Instead, I told him, we gave them nothing to react against. No warships to defend against. No threats to negotiate away. No enemy to rally their people behind. We simply told the truth once, completely, and then we stepped back and let our absence speak for the rest of it. There is no story a diplomat can tell about an absence. There is nothing to argue with. There is only the growing, undeniable fact that an entire species has decided you are no longer worth their attention, and that fact gets heavier every day it continues, because there is no dramatic moment anyone can point to and say, "This is when it will end." Corin sat with that answer for a long time before speaking again. He asked whether humanity intended for this to last indefinitely, whether there was some final resolution being planned that the rest of the coalition simply had not been told about yet. I told him, honestly, that I did not know, and that I believed very few humans knew, because the response had never been built around a fixed endpoint. It had been built around a standard, a shared understanding that this was simply how humanity would treat a species that had shown, through its own actions, exactly how little respect it held for boundaries it had never bothered to ask about. As long as that understanding remained true for the people carrying it out, the response would continue, not because anyone had ordered it to, but because nobody had found a reason to stop. Over the following months, the effect on the Vethrans grew impossible for the rest of the coalition to ignore, even for species that had initially dismissed the whole situation as an overreaction from an emotional young species. Vethran trade revenue, once among the strongest in the coalition, continued its slow decline. Vethran diplomatic influence, built over 2 centuries of careful relationship building, began eroding in ways that had nothing directly to do with humans at all. Other species, watching what had happened, began quietly reconsidering their own relationships with the Vethrans, not out of any particular loyalty to humanity, but out of a colder, more practical fear. If an entire species as young and as widely respected as humans had decided to withdraw completely from any relationship with the Vethrans, based on a single documented incident, what did that suggest about the risk of continuing to trust Vethran custom themselves? Species that had once accepted the occasional small sacrifice as simply the price of Vethran partnership began asking harder questions, began reviewing old agreements more carefully, began requesting, for the first time in generations, explicit written boundaries around what future gestures of respect would and would not include. The Vethrans, to their credit, tried repeatedly to repair what had happened. Ambassador Corvain Thess was eventually replaced by a new diplomatic representative, a younger Vethran named Selen Areth, who arrived with what appeared to be a genuine, carefully prepared attempt at reconciliation. She requested meetings with human representatives across multiple systems, offered detailed proposals for restitution that went well beyond what had originally been taken from Meridian, and even attempted, through several intermediary species, to arrange informal conversations with human officials outside official diplomatic channels. Every attempt met the same quiet, immovable wall. Meetings acknowledged and never scheduled. Proposals received and never formally rejected, simply left without response, indefinitely, in a way that made rejection almost impossible to formally challenge because nothing had technically been refused. I read one particular exchange in the Coalition public record that stayed with me for a long time afterward, a message from Selen Areth to a human trade office, asking directly and plainly what the Vethrans could do to move forward. The response, when it eventually came, 3 weeks after her message, consisted of a single sentence. The record from Meridian remains the complete and final account, and human channels have no further requests to make regarding the Vethran people at this time. It was the exact same sentence, word for word, that had been given to Corvain Thess nearly a year earlier. Not out of laziness or lack of care in drafting a response, I believe, and I have come to believe this strongly, that the sentence was repeated deliberately, precisely because repeating it, unchanged, sent a message no amount of new proposals could shift. This is not a negotiation that is currently open. It has not opened in a year. It will not open simply because you have asked again more politely. I asked Colonel Whitfield about this during a rare visit she made to Corin Watch nearly 14 months after Meridian. She had aged visibly since I had last seen her, carrying the particular kind of tiredness that comes from holding a long, difficult discipline steady for far longer than anyone expects it to be necessary. I asked her whether human command believed the Vethrans had suffered enough, whether there was any consideration being given to finally allowing the relationship to resume. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, and her answer has stayed with me ever since, because I think it captures something true not just about the Vethrans, but about the particular kind of resolve humanity had discovered in itself during that entire ordeal. This was never about making them suffer, she said. It was about making sure that trust, once broken this completely, could not simply be repaired through an apology and a nicely worded proposal. Trust is not owed to anyone simply because enough time has passed since they broke it. It has to be earned back, slowly, through a change the other party can actually demonstrate, not requested through paperwork, addressed to an office that stopped answering a long time ago. I asked her, finally, what it would actually take for that door to open again. She looked at me for a long time before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I do not know," she said, "and I think that not knowing is exactly the point. A species that took as much as they did, so carelessly, deserves to sit with genuine uncertainty about whether forgiveness is even possible, for exactly as long as it takes for that uncertainty to mean something real to them. When they finally understand that, truly understand it, we will know. Until then, there is nothing more to say. I did not fully understand, standing there on Corin watch, nearly a year and a half after that red light first appeared on my wrist screen, that the silence humanity had built around the Vethrans was not a temporary punishment with a hidden expiration date. It was something closer to a permanent shift in how an entire species understood us, one that would outlast my own career, outlast Colonel Whitfield's command, outlast quite possibly the lifetime of everyone who had lived through Meridian directly. The Vethrans had built their entire diplomatic identity around the idea that they understood every species they encountered well enough to know exactly what those species could afford to lose. At Meridian, they had finally met a species they did not understand at all, and the cost of that misunderstanding, delivered without a single act of aggression, without a single threat, without a single raised voice, would follow them for far longer than any war ever could have. 6 years passed before I told this story out loud for the first time, and I want to be honest about why it took me that long. It was not because the memory had faded. If anything, the details stayed sharper in my mind than almost anything else from my years of service. The red light on my wrist screen, my sister's steady voice teaching children about survival, Margaret Voss's 11 minutes of silence, Colonel Whitfield's tired eyes telling me that trust had to be earned back through demonstrated change, not requested through paperwork. I remembered all of it clearly. I simply had no reason to speak of it, because within human circles, an unspoken agreement had settled over the entire subject, the same way it had settled over trade routes and diplomatic schedules years earlier. We did not talk about the Vethrans, not out of fear and not out of guilt. We simply did not talk about them, the same quiet, collective decision that had shaped every other part of our response from the very beginning. I am telling this story now because a young officer aboard my current posting, a communications specialist barely out of training named Mira Voss, no relation to Margaret that I am aware of, asked me directly during a slow shift why the Coalition archives contained such a strange, thorough silence around an entire species that had once been a major diplomatic power. She had found references to the Vethrans scattered through old trade records, old Coalition membership rosters, and then almost nothing at all after a certain point, as though an entire civilization had simply stopped being mentioned by anyone with any real influence, all at roughly the same moment in history. She asked me what happened to them. I did not answer immediately. I sat with the question for a while, the way Margaret Voss must have sat with her own 11 minutes of silence all those years ago, and I found myself thinking, not about anger, but about how strange it was that an entire species could vanish from relevance without a single act of violence ever being committed against them. The truth, as far as I understand it, is this. Nobody destroyed the Vethrans. Nobody invaded their worlds or seized their resources in return for what had been taken at Meridian. What happened to them was slower and, I have come to believe, far more complete than any war could have managed. Over the years following Meridian, as human withdrawal from Vethran trade and diplomacy continued without any announced end date, other Coalition species gradually followed the same pattern, each for their own reasons, each arriving independently at conclusions that mirrored exactly what humanity had decided years earlier. Species that had once accepted small, unquestioned sacrifices as the price of Vethran friendship began demanding explicit agreements instead, and veteran diplomats, trained for 2 centuries in a style of relationship building that assumed deep understanding and quiet generosity would always be enough, struggled badly to adapt to partners who now insisted on writing everything down, on asking permission before anything was taken, on treating every gesture of goodwill with the careful suspicion that Meridian had taught the entire coalition to hold. Vethron economic influence, once significant across dozens of systems, continued its slow decline for nearly a decade after the initial incident. Vethron diplomatic missions, once welcomed eagerly by newly contacted species eager for coalition guidance, began finding themselves consistently overlooked in favor of other, more established coalition members willing to offer mentorship without the particular cultural assumptions that had caused so much damage at Meridian. It was never a formal exclusion. No coalition vote ever stripped the Vethrans of their membership or their rights within the wider community. They simply found themselves, gradually and then completely, no longer central to anything that mattered. I told Mira all of this, as clearly and as calmly as I could, and when I finished, she sat quietly for a while, before asking the question I had been expecting since she first brought up the subject. "Why did nobody ever forgive them?" she asked. "It has been years. Surely at some point, someone decided enough time had passed." I thought carefully about how to answer her, because I did not want to give her the simple version of this story, the version where humans simply punished a species that wronged us and moved on satisfied. That was never what this was, and I think it matters that the true shape of it be understood clearly, even now, even this far removed from everything that happened. I told her that forgiveness, as far as I understood it, had never actually been withheld. What had been withheld was the assumption that forgiveness was owed automatically, simply because enough time had passed, simply because a formal apology had eventually been offered, simply because the offending party had grown uncomfortable with the consequences of what they had done. Humanity, and eventually much of the coalition alongside us, had decided that trust broken as completely and as carelessly as it had been at Meridian required something the Vethrans never quite managed to offer, which was genuine, demonstrated change sustained over time, rather than a well-worded request for the relationship to simply resume as though nothing had happened. I do not know, I told her honestly, whether the Vethrans ever fully achieved that change. I know that in recent years coalition reports suggest a quieter, more careful Vethran diplomatic presence has slowly begun rebuilding relationships with smaller, newer coalition members, always asking clearly before taking anything, always writing every agreement down in exhaustive detail, always, according to species who have dealt with them recently, unusually careful never to assume they understand what another species values without simply asking directly. Whether that change is real, or whether it will ever be enough to fully reopen the doors that closed after Meridian, I honestly could not tell you. That question was never mine to answer alone, and I suspect it never will be answered by any single person or single moment. It will be answered slowly, the same way everything else in this story unfolded, one quiet decision at a time, across an entire species, over a span of years long enough that most of the people who lived through the beginning of it will not be present to see however it eventually ends. Mira asked me one final question before our shift ended that day, and it is the question I want to leave you with, because I think it captures something true about why this story matters at all, beyond the simple facts of what happened. She asked whether I thought humanity had been right to respond the way we did, rather than through some more direct confrontation that might have resolved everything more quickly, one way or another. I told her I did not know how to answer that question with complete certainty, because I do not think there was ever a clean, obviously correct choice available to us in that moment. What I told her instead was this. I told her that I had grown up believing, the way most people do, that strength looked like force, that the most powerful response to being wronged was the loudest one, the one that could not be ignored or dismissed. What Meridian taught me, and what the years that followed only confirmed more deeply, was that there is another kind of strength entirely, quieter and far harder to sustain, the kind that requires an entire species to agree, without ever needing to say it aloud to each other, that some wounds are not healed through noise, and that the truth, told once and completely, can sometimes accomplish more than any force ever could. I think about my sister often, still teaching on Meridian to this day, still telling children about hard winters and careful festivals and the particular kind of courage that comes from refusing to let fear make your decisions for you. I think about Margaret Voss's 11 minutes of silence, and about Colonel Whitfield's tired eyes telling me that trust had to be earned, slowly, through change that could actually be seen. I think about Grace Ferris, working through the night to make certain that a single record, released only once, could never be challenged or denied by anyone who tried. And I think, most of all, about the particular kind of fury we chose that year, the kind that never raised its voice even once, that never struck a single blow, that simply told the truth and then stepped quietly back, patient enough to let an entire civilization sit with the full weight of what it had done, for exactly as long as it took for that weight to finally mean something. That is why, if you ever attend a coalition gathering and notice how rarely the Vethrans come up in conversation, even now, even this many years later, you should understand that the silence is not an accident, and it was never really about them at all. It became, somewhere along the way, a reflection of who we decided to be when someone reached into the oldest, most carefully guarded part of us and took something without asking. We did not become louder that year. We became quieter, more deliberate, more careful about what trust we extended and to whom, and that quiet, patient discipline turned out to be the most complete answer any of us could have given. So when someone asks you, as Mira asked me, why nobody talks about the Vethrans anymore, you can tell them what I finally told her, sitting together on a slow shift many years after it all began. We are not silent because we forgot. We are silent because, for once, silence said everything that needed to be said, and we have never found a good reason to say it any louder than that.